The First Order isn't a Star Wars story. It's a Disney story. And today, I'm going to show you the insurgency model you were robbed of, and why Disney chose the laziest alternative imaginable. The First Order would have been more realistic, more compelling, and more thematically rich as an insurgency movement spreading through ideological radicalization and asymmetric warfare. But Disney looked at the most fertile storytelling ground in modern science fiction and decided to photocopy the original trilogy instead, because Empire iconography was safe, marketable, and required zero creative risk. That's the case I'm prosecuting. And the evidence isn't circumstantial. George Lucas built Star Wars the way an architect builds a cathedral, with load-bearing walls of history underneath every visible surface. In a 2015 interview with James Cameron, he laid it bare. The Rebel Alliance was modeled on the Viet Cong. The Galactic Empire was modeled on the United States military. That inversion, scrappy insurgents as heroes, a technologically superior superpower as villain, gave the franchise its gravitational pull. Palpatine's political rise in the prequels drew directly from the fall of the Roman Republic, specifically how Julius Caesar and Augustus manufactured crises to extract emergency powers from a Senate that handed over its authority willingly. The Empire's visual language came from 1930s Nazi Germany, from officer uniforms to the rally aesthetics of Death Star assemblies. The Jedi filtered samurai culture through Akira Kurosawa and Joseph Campbell. Every layer rested on human history, and that history is what gave Star Wars its weight. In October 2012, the Walt Disney Company purchased Lucasfilm for $4.05 billion. CEO Bob Iger's mandate was straightforward, even if no one said it out loud. Minimize creative risk, rely on nostalgia, recoup the investment. The original trilogy was the most beloved film franchise in history. The prequels had divided the fan base. Safest possible play? Give audiences the original trilogy again. Same shapes, same sounds, same feelings. And trust that familiarity would print money. From a business standpoint, the calculus worked. The Force Awakens grossed over $2 billion worldwide. From a storytelling standpoint, it was catastrophic. The sequel trilogy's villain faction wouldn't be designed by asking what would realistically emerge from the ashes of the Galactic Empire. It would be designed by asking what existing Imperial iconography could trigger maximum nostalgia in a theater full of adults chasing the feeling they had when they were 12. Lucas himself had provided outlines for the sequel trilogy. Disney discarded them, utilizing a contractual agreement that allowed them to ignore his narrative plans entirely. The man who studied the fall of Rome to write a Senate scene was replaced by a corporate apparatus that studied the original trilogy's merchandise sales to design a villain. Imperial iconography sells merchandise. Guerrilla cells don't sell anything. December 2015. The Force Awakens opens, and the First Order arrives looking exactly like the Galactic Empire, wearing a slightly different hat. Stormtroopers in redesigned helmets. A black-clad Force user in a mask channeling Darth Vader. Except Kylo Ren wore a mask he didn't need, because Vader wore a mask he did need, and the visual rhyme mattered more than narrative logic. Starkiller Base replaced the Death Star, its only innovation being a larger diameter. Supreme Leader Snoke mirrored the Emperor, mysterious dark-side puppet master on a throne. General Hux mirrored Grand Moff Tarkin, sneering military zealot barking orders from the bridge of a Star Destroyer. The shapes were identical. The geometry of the conflict was a carbon copy. The plot mirrors A New Hope beat for beat. A droid carrying vital information lands on a desert planet. A Force-sensitive young person living in poverty finds it. They're swept into a conflict against a planet-destroying superweapon that must be destroyed by a small fighter attack on a structural vulnerability. A masked, dark-side villain pursues them. A beloved mentor figure dies on a bridge, literally and figuratively. The parallels are so precise they stop being homage and become reproduction. Behind the camera sat J.J. Abrams, a filmmaker who'd publicly outlined his creative philosophy in a TED Talk about what he called the mystery box. The concept was seductive. Audience engagement is sustained by questions, not answers. Snoke's identity, Rey's parentage, Luke's absence, the First Order's origins. Abrams introduced every one of these as tantalizing unknowns without planned answers for any of them. The mystery box treated world-building as unnecessary overhead. You didn't need to know where the First Order came from or how they'd built a weapon capable of destroying star systems, because the mystery itself was the product. The box was more interesting unopened. But this philosophy carried a specific, devastating consequence for the villain faction at the center of the trilogy. If you don't know where a villain came from, you can't make them anything other than aesthetically familiar. An insurgency requires context, an ideological pipeline, the radicalization of displaced populations, the exploitation of a power vacuum. That kind of villain demands world-building. A villain that looks exactly like the old villain requires only recognition. Audiences see Star Destroyers and Stormtroopers, and their brains fill in the gaps automatically. Abrams was exploiting pre-existing associations rather than constructing new ones. It worked for exactly one movie. The moment audiences began asking how any of this had come to pass, where the fleet was built, how the galaxy had apparently regressed to the exact status quo of A New Hope when the Empire supposedly fell 30 years earlier, the illusion shattered, and no mystery box could reassemble it. What followed was 3 films made by different directors with different visions, no shared story Bible, and no unified plan. Abrams posed the questions. Rian Johnson answered some of them by deliberate subversion. Snoke is nobody. Rey's parents are nobody. The past must die. Then Abrams returned for The Rise of Skywalker and reversed Johnson's answers with the narrative grace of a highway U-turn, revealing that Rey was a Palpatine. The First Order had always been a puppet, and the ultimate villain had been the Emperor himself the entire time. Emperor Palpatine, thrown down a reactor shaft and exploded in Return of the Jedi, the culmination of 6 films of narrative, was resurrected off-screen between movies, with no setup, no foreshadowing, and no explanation beyond the most infamous line of dialogue in modern blockbuster cinema. Somehow, Palpatine returned. That single line retroactively gutted the First Order's credibility as an independent threat. Their entire existence was reduced to a puppet show run by a dead man's hand. 3 films of avoided villain development collapsed into the admission that nobody had ever figured out what the First Order actually was. Every mystery box opened, and every single one was empty. Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy claimed in a 2019 Rolling Stone interview that there was no source material to draw from, ignoring decades of established Legends continuity that had already explored the post-Endor galaxy with far more imagination than anything the sequel trilogy would attempt. And the irony ran deeper. Disney's own publishing arm was simultaneously producing novels building exactly the kind of post-Endor galaxy the films refused to depict. Chuck Wendig's Aftermath trilogy and Claudia Gray's Bloodline established that the New Republic had passed a military disarmament act, dramatically reducing its armed forces in a wave of post-war idealism. Those novels showed a Senate fracturing along political lines, centrists wanting strong central government versus populists preferring decentralized federation. They revealed that Leia Organa had been politically destroyed when her parentage as Darth Vader's daughter was publicly exposed, marginalizing the one leader who understood the emerging threat. They detailed Palpatine's contingency plan, his posthumous insurance policy that ceded resources and radicalized Imperial remnants in the unknown regions. Every element of a compelling insurgency narrative was already written, already canon, already approved by Lucasfilm. The films never touched any of it. Somehow, Palpatine returned. The audience's instinct that an insurgency-driven First Order would have been more realistic and dramatically compelling is supported by every piece of world-building Disney's own canon had already established. And the version of the First Order that this principle generates is genuinely terrifying. 30 years after Endor, the Galactic Empire is dead. The Death Stars are debris fields. The Emperor is gone. But the galaxy hasn't found peace, because galaxies are never at peace after empires fall. The New Republic, desperate to prove it's nothing like the regime it replaced, has passed the Military Disarmament Act. Its fleet is a shadow of what the rebellion once commanded. Its Senate is gridlocked between centrists and populists who can't agree on how to govern a galaxy. In Bloodline, Claudia Gray mapped this dysfunction with surgical precision. The centrist-populist divide had fractured the Republic's political will to respond, creating a Senate so gridlocked by tribal factions that it couldn't recognize an existential threat forming on its borders. The Republic was paralyzed not by an enemy, but by itself. And Leia Organa, the one person with the credibility and foresight to sound the alarm, had been politically neutralized. When her biological parentage, that Darth Vader was her father, was publicly exposed, her career in the Senate ended overnight. The woman who'd helped destroy the Empire was suddenly the daughter of its enforcer, and a Senate already fractured by tribalism used her bloodline as a weapon. She was pushed to the margins, stripped of influence, left to build the resistance from scraps, while the government she'd fought to create ignored every warning she sent. The Republic was a glass house. Somewhere in the unknown regions, someone was picking up stones. The First Order, in this version, doesn't announce itself with star destroyers. It announces itself with whispers. In the Outer Rim, on worlds the Republic never bothered to govern effectively, former Imperial officers who lost everything, careers, status, identities, begin organizing. Not as a government or a military, as cells. Small, decentralized, self-sufficient units connected by ideology rather than command structure. Palpatine's contingency, understood through this lens, functions as an insurgency in a box. Weapons caches hidden on remote worlds, encrypted communications networks buried in the HoloNet's infrastructure, loyalists embedded in the Republic's own bureaucracy. The dead Emperor didn't aim for resurrection. He aimed to ensure that no successor government would ever know a moment of stability. The recruitment pipeline writes itself with lore that already exists. Millions of Imperial officers, soldiers, and bureaucrats were suddenly unemployed after Endor. The Galactic Concordance, the treaty that ended the war, demanded the Empire's surrender and dissolution, but offered nothing resembling a reintegration plan. It won and walked away, leaving a population of displaced, humiliated, radicalized former servants of a regime that had given them purpose and identity. Post-Endor Legends canon already depicted Imperial warlords like Zinj carving out personal fiefdoms from the wreckage, demonstrating the fragmentation and desperate power-grabbing that follows Imperial collapse. Transpose that into the insurgency model. Instead of warlords building petty empires, imagine those same displaced Imperials scattered across the Outer Rim, watching the Republic fumble through peacetime governance while their children grow up hungry. They don't need a Death Star. They need a cause. And the cause is self-generating. The galaxy was better when the Empire kept order, and the Republic is too weak to stop anyone from proving it. Brendel Hux, already established in canon as the architect of a child soldier program, becomes the movement's most dangerous asset. Not a general building an army, an ideologue building a generation. He takes the children of displaced Imperials, children who grew up in exile camps and on barren worlds in the unknown regions, and he trains them not just to fight, but to believe. First Order stormtroopers, in this version, are true believers rather than faceless cannon fodder. They are the children of a fallen empire who've been told since birth that the Republic stole their birthright. Some become saboteurs. Others become infiltrators who disappear into civilian populations rather than marching in formation. Some become the worst thing any counterinsurgency can face, willing martyrs. Imagine what this indoctrination looks like on screen. A training facility on a frozen world in the unknown regions. Children no older than 6 or 7 running combat drills. Instructors teaching them a version of galactic history where the Empire brought peace and the rebellion brought chaos. A child who hesitates during a loyalty exercise is removed from the group. No one asks where he went. The camera lingers on a girl, maybe 8 years old, reciting a catechism about Imperial order with perfect conviction. and behind her eyes, nothing. No doubt, no fear, total certainty. That image is more disturbing than 100 Starkiller bases, because it can't be blown up. Finn's defection, reimagined through this lens, becomes a young man deprogramming himself from a lifetime of this indoctrination. Every instinct he has was planted by someone else. Every moral certainty he abandoned had to be rebuilt from scratch. His hands shake when he picks up a blaster because he was trained to use one before he could read. That is a far more harrowing and human story than a soldier who simply decides in one moment that he doesn't want to shoot civilians. Now give this movement a brain. Timothy Zahn's Thrawn campaigns already proved the concept. Thrawn, working with a fraction of the Empire's former resources, nearly brought the New Republic to its knees through psychological manipulation, intelligence exploitation, and the strategic application of violence at precisely the right pressure points. That's the philosophy an insurgent First Order would internalize. They don't build Starkiller base. They target the Republic's fragile infrastructure with surgical precision. A single operative walks through Senate District Security on Hosnian Prime, carrying a Republic 1D badge, and detonates an explosive in the chamber gallery, killing 3 senators. The HoloNet erupts. Nobody knows who did it. Another cell sabotages a major hyperspace trade route in the Mid-Rim, collapsing commerce across 40 systems and starving 3 Outer Rim worlds that depended on those shipments. A third cell hijacks a regional HoloNet relay and broadcasts a propaganda message, not crude imperial nostalgia, but a carefully crafted argument that the Republic abandoned the Outer Rim, that the Republic's own demilitarization proves it can't protect its citizens, that only strength can hold a galaxy together. The message plays for 11 minutes before Republic slicers shut it down. By then, 100 million beings have heard it, and a percentage of them are nodding. This is asymmetric warfare. This is what makes a villain terrifying. Not raw firepower, but the inability to find them, define them, or predict where the next strike lands. You can't blow up an ideology. You can't fly an X-Wing into a belief system. The Death Star had an exhaust port, and insurgency has no equivalent structural weakness. An insurgent First Order operates on that principle. You can't aim the fleet at them because there's no fleet to aim at. You can't bomb their base because they don't have one base. They have 1,000 apartments, 100 cantina backrooms, 10,000 encrypted HoloNet channels. Snoke, in this version, doesn't sit on a throne in a Star Destroyer. He's a voice, a signal, a presence felt through the Force that reaches into the unknown regions and amplifies the hatred and resentment already festering in every displaced Imperial who lost their world when the Empire fell. He doesn't need to be Emperor 2.0. He needs to be the connective tissue between cells that would otherwise be isolated. A dark side frequency broadcasting purpose to a scattered and furious diaspora. His power isn't political, it's psychological. He makes isolated, angry people feel like they belong to something vast. Picture a first film where the New Republic doesn't even believe the First Order exists as a unified entity. Individual attacks are dismissed as piracy, as local unrest, as the inevitable messiness of post-war reconstruction. Leia knows better. She spent years warning the Senate, and the Senate has spent years ignoring her, especially after the revelation of her father's identity destroyed her political credibility. She forms the resistance not to fight a war, but to prove a war is coming. The first film is a thriller, espionage, betrayal, the slow dawning horror that the attacks are coordinated, that there's a network, that the Republic's own disarmament has left it blind and defenseless. Andor. That's the cruelest irony in all of this. Disney's own studio produced exactly the kind of morally complex, insurgency-driven Star Wars storytelling that the sequel trilogy should have delivered. Andor proved that audiences don't need Death Stars to stay engaged. They need stakes that feel real, institutions that feel broken, and characters caught in systems bigger than themselves. Andor exists as living proof that Disney can do this. They simply chose not to, when the stakes and the budgets were highest. A second film could show the insurgency metastasizing, cells in the core worlds, a first-order sympathizer elected to the Senate, an assassination of a Republic military commander that triggers a political crisis, centrists blaming populists, populists blaming centrists, the Senate tearing itself apart while the First Order watches and waits. Kylo Ren, in this version, becomes a radicalized convert, a member of the Republic's own ruling family who was seduced not by a throne room, but by an ideology, by the argument that democracy is weakness and that the Force itself demands hierarchy. His fall mirrors the radicalization pipeline that created the movement he joins. He isn't imitating his grandfather's armor. He's fulfilling what he believes his grandfather's empire was always trying to achieve. And that makes him more dangerous than any masked cosplayer, because his conviction comes from the same well that feeds every true believer in the First Order's ranks. A third film could show the Republic fractured, the resistance vindicated but too late, and the First Order stepping out of the shadows, not with a fleet of Star Destroyers materializing from nowhere, but with a galaxy that's already half convinced the Republic deserved to fall. The final battle wouldn't be a trench run against a superweapon. It would be a fight for the soul of a civilization, where the enemy is an idea spreading faster than any fleet can chase it, and you can't destroy an idea with a proton torpedo. That's the trilogy that could have existed. Every piece of it's grounded in Disney's own canon. The Aftermath novels provided the power vacuum, a demilitarized republic stumbling through reconstruction. Bloodline laid bare the political fracture, a Senate so gridlocked by tribal factions that it couldn't recognize an existential threat forming on its borders. Brendel Hux's child soldier program, already canonical, provided the radicalization pipeline that would turn displaced children into fanatics. Palpatine's contingency seeded the infrastructure, the weapons caches, the communications networks, the embedded loyalists. And Thrawn's campaigns proved, decades before the sequels were filmed, that intelligence-driven asymmetric warfare is dramatically compelling in the Star Wars universe. Lucasfilm had the blueprints in their own filing cabinet. They just never opened the drawer. Instead, we got Starkiller Base, a Death Star with a bigger diameter. We got Snoke, an emperor on a throne with no backstory and a shelf life of 2 films. We got a First Order exposed as a puppet entity in The Rise of Skywalker, the most visible villain faction in the franchise reduced to a narrative placeholder, which is what happens when you run out of ideas and trust that spectacle will substitute for vision. And somehow, Palpatine returned. Oscar Isaac delivered that line. He delivered it because the script required him to, and because the creative machinery behind the sequel trilogy had exhausted every other option. John Boyega would later make public comments about how the trilogy handled his character. The actors weren't the problem. They never were. The problem was institutional, a $4.05 billion acquisition that demanded returns on a timeline incompatible with the kind of patient, architecturally sound world-building Lucas had practiced for decades. Lucas used history to build a galaxy. Disney used a photocopier to reproduce one. What stays with me isn't the trilogy we got. Mediocre blockbusters come and go. It's how close we were to something extraordinary. The infrastructure was built. The lore was written. The proof of concept existed. In Thrawn's campaigns, in the Aftermath novels, in Bloodline's political nightmare, and eventually in Andor itself. A version of the First Order lived on paper, in canon, in the collective imagination of millions of fans, that would have been the most terrifying villain in Star Wars history. Not because of superweapons, because of ideas. Because an enemy you can't find is scarier than an enemy you can see. Because radicalization is harder to fight than a battle station. Because the fall of an empire was never the end of the story. It was always the beginning of something far more dangerous. Disney had that story. They held it in their hands, and they fed it into a photocopier, pressed the button, and called it new. Somehow, Palpatine returned. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.